It cuts through the November fog like broken glass. High, performative, the kind of practiced gaiety that dies the moment the door closes. Somewhere behind the crumbling brick facades of Miller's Court, a woman is negotiating the price of her survival. The year is 1888, and Mary Jane Kelly is about to make the last transaction of her life. She doesn't know this yet. She only knows that the rent collector came this morning, that her stomach has been empty since yesterday, and that the man standing in her doorway is offering enough coins for a bed, a meal, maybe even a small bottle of gin to quiet the voices in her head that whisper about the girl she used to be. The one who arrived from Ireland with dreams tucked carefully in her traveling case. The one who believed London meant salvation. Before we go further into this world that Victorian society built but refused to see, I have to ask, where are you right now as you're hearing this? It genuinely astounds me that we can reach across continents and centuries to uncover these deliberately buried truths together. Mary's story ends in blood that November night, her body mutilated beyond recognition by the man history would call Jack the Ripper. But her story begins much earlier, in a system so perfectly designed to consume women that it operated for decades without respectable society acknowledging it existed at all. This is not a story about Jack the Ripper. This is a story about the machinery of exploitation that delivered Mary Kelly and thousands like her directly into the hands of whoever was waiting in the darkness. A machinery that wore the respectable mask of Victorian morality while grinding human beings into currency. The mathematics were simple and devastating. A housemaid in 1880s London earned roughly £12 per year, barely enough for food and clothing, nothing left for emergencies or illness. A single week unable to work meant potential homelessness. Pregnancy meant certain dismissal with no legal recourse. Marriage offered escape only if a woman could attract a man capable of supporting a family, which in communities where male unemployment exceeded 40% meant marriage was a luxury most could not afford. And for women already outside the boundaries of respectability, the widows, the abandoned mothers, the domestics dismissed after being assaulted by their employers, the options narrowed to a single, terrible calculus. Dr. William Acton, whose 1857 study of prostitution shocked middle-class readers who preferred not to think about such matters, estimated that London alone contained between 80 and 120,000 women engaged in sex work. His clinical language, unfortunates, fallen women, necessitous females, couldn't disguise what his statistics revealed, that Victorian prostitution wasn't a moral aberration but an economic system, as fundamental to the functioning of respectable society as the coal that heated drawing rooms or the servants who scrubbed front steps before dawn. Walk into any establishment on the spectrum between luxury and desperation, and you'd find the same fundamental transaction dressed in different costumes. In the grand houses of St. John's Wood, women in silk gowns entertained members of Parliament and industrialists in rooms decorated to resemble respectable middle-class parlors. The illusion was crucial. These men didn't want to feel like they were purchasing sex. They wanted to feel like they were seducing ladies who happened to appreciate expensive gifts. Mrs. Jeffries, who operated several such establishments in the 1870s, understood this perfectly. Her employees learned to speak properly, to discuss literature and current events, to maintain the fiction that they were respectable women who simply enjoyed male company and occasionally accepted tokens of appreciation. But the elegant facade couldn't hide the fundamental mechanics of bondage. Women who entered Mrs. Jeffries's establishments quickly discovered that the beautiful dresses, the private rooms, the fine meals all came with price tags that accrued faster than earnings. A gown suitable for entertaining wealthy clients might cost 6 months' wages. Room and board were calculated at rates triple what they'd pay in lodging houses. Medical examinations, mandatory to protect clients from venereal disease, carried fees that ensured most women owed more each month than they earned. The debt became a chain more effective than any physical restraint, because it was reinforced by the women's own calculation that, returning to the streets, to the common lodging houses and casual prostitution that awaited those without protection, meant conditions far worse than the velvet-lined exploitation they currently endured. Inspector Frederick Aberline, who would later lead the Ripper investigation, had raided Mrs. Jeffries' properties in 1885 as part of a reform campaign following journalist W.T. Stead's explosive exposé on child trafficking. What troubled him most wasn't what he found, but what he couldn't charge anyone with. The women appeared healthy, well-dressed, and when questioned, insisted they remained voluntarily. "How do you prosecute circumstances?" he wrote in a private letter. "How do you arrest the absence of alternatives?" The alternatives were visible every night on the streets of Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Shadwell, where women like Catherine Eddowes negotiated prices in doorways and passages, vulnerable to weather, violence, and a legal system that criminalized their survival strategies while ignoring the economic conditions that made those strategies necessary. Catherine had been born in Wolverhampton in 1842, worked as a tin plate stamper, respectable industrial labor, before economic depression closed the factories and sent her searching for work in London. By September 1888, she was 46 years old, which in the brutal economy of street prostitution made her nearly invisible to potential clients who could choose from hundreds of younger women equally desperate for the fourpence needed for a lodging house bed. The night of September 29th, police arrested Catherine for drunk and disorderly conduct, a common charge for women whose only refuge from grinding poverty was the temporary oblivion of cheap gin. They released her just after midnight on September 30th, and she walked out of Bishopsgate Police Station with fourpence in her pocket. Enough for a bed, not enough for food. She made a calculation that thousands of women made every night, turning toward the narrow streets where men with a few coins sought brief encounters that cost women everything, while costing the men nothing but pocket change and whatever moral discomfort they could suppress long enough to complete the transaction. Catherine's body was found at 1:45 a.m. in Mitre Square, her throat cut so deeply it nearly severed her head, her abdomen opened and organs removed with what the police surgeon called considerable anatomical knowledge. But Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown's post-mortem report revealed something more disturbing than the spectacular violence that would make Catherine famous as one of Jack the Ripper's victims. His clinical notes documented evidence of chronic kidney disease, liver damage from prolonged alcohol consumption, severe malnutrition, and scarring that suggested previous violent encounters. The deceased, he wrote in the careful language of medical documentation, was already dying by degrees from conditions entirely preventable with adequate nutrition and basic medical care. This was the real horror that Victorian society worked so carefully to ignore. Not that women were occasionally murdered by theatrical killers, but that they were routinely ground to death by the ordinary functioning of an economic system that required their exploitation while criminalizing their existence. The Salvation Army's Catherine Booth, who worked directly with women attempting to escape prostitution, documented the impossible barriers they faced. "We teach them skills," she wrote in an 1889 report, "needlework, laundry, basic literacy, but respectable employers won't hire women with histories they consider disreputable. The factory pays starvation wages for 14-hour days. Domestic service means vulnerability to sexual demands from male employers with no legal recourse, so they return to the only trade where their labor commands sufficient value to survive, and we call this choice." The women who didn't return, who managed against enormous odds to build lives outside the sex trade, remained permanently marked. Hannah Colwick, a domestic servant whose secret diaries provided rare insight into working-class women's lives, recorded her terror of the fate that awaited women who lost their positions. "Margaret, who worked here before me, went on the streets after she fell ill and couldn't work," Hannah wrote in 1860. "I see her sometimes, and she looks through me like I'm glass, like she's already dead and just hasn't stopped walking yet." The establishments that consumed these women existed on a spectrum from barely concealed luxury to desperate squalor, but all operated on the same fundamental principle, that women's bodies could be converted into currency, and that the machinery of law and social custom would protect the men who made the conversion while criminalizing the women who had no choice but to participate. Josephine Butler, the feminist reformer who spent decades fighting the contagious diseases acts that subjected prostitutes to forced medical examinations while leaving their male clients untouched, understood this hypocrisy with crystalline clarity. "We speak of fallen women," she wrote, "as though they fell from some great height by their own moral failure. But they did not fall. They were pushed by poverty, by lack of legal rights, by a society that offers women precisely two identities, wife or whore, and then makes being a wife economically impossible for most." The Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in the 1860s ostensibly to protect military personnel from venereal infection, embodied every contradiction in Victorian society's approach to prostitution. The laws allowed police to arrest any woman suspected of sex work and subject her to invasive medical examination. Women who refused could be imprisoned. Women found infected were confined to lock hospitals until deemed cured. But the men who purchased sex and spread disease faced no legal consequences whatsoever. The acts treated women as vectors of contamination, while treating male sexuality as a natural force requiring management but not moral judgment. Butler's campaign against these laws mobilized thousands of women who recognized the broader implications: that any legal framework treating women's bodies as public property subject to state control threatened all women, not just those engaged in prostitution. Today, they examine prostitutes without consent, Butler argued. Tomorrow they claim authority over any woman whose behavior they deem insufficiently respectable. The acts were finally repealed in 1886, but the attitudes they embodied, that women's sexuality required control while men's required accommodation, persisted in the laws and customs that made Victorian prostitution both ubiquitous and invisible. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, one of the first women licensed to practice medicine in Britain, documented the medical consequences of this system with the precision unavailable to male physicians who rarely treated prostitutes as full human beings. Her patient records from the 1880s catalog the predictable progression: malnutrition weakening immune systems, untreated venereal diseases destroying reproductive organs and eventually attacking cardiovascular and nervous systems, injuries from violence that healed poorly without proper care, chronic respiratory infections from exposure to cold and damp, and the psychological trauma that manifested as depression, alcoholism, and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. "The physical deterioration is systematic," Dr. Blackwell wrote, "but the psychological damage often proves more devastating and permanent. I have treated women who survived syphilis but never recovered from years of sustained violation disguised as commerce. They develop what I can only describe as a splitting of the self. The woman who endures the work becomes someone separate from the woman who exists in the remaining hours, and maintaining this division requires enormous psychological energy that eventually exhausts the mind's capacity to function." The autumn of 1888 brought this carefully maintained invisibility crashing into public consciousness when the Whitechapel murderer began his work. Mary Ann Nichols on August 31st, Annie Chapman on September 8th, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes in the double event of September 30th, Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th. The murders were spectacular in their brutality, but their true significance lay in how they forced respectable society to acknowledge, however briefly, the existence of women whose lives and deaths normally passed without notice. George Bernard Shaw, writing in the Star newspaper as the murders unfolded, recognized what others missed. "The Whitechapel murders are not the work of a monster," he argued, "but the inevitable result of social conditions that create monsters by treating thousands of women as disposable commodities. Yes, find this killer and hang him. But understand that he merely makes visible the violence that society inflicts on these women every single day through starvation wages, legal exclusion, and systematic denial of their humanity." Mary Kelly's death on November 9th proved particularly shocking because the killer had taken time with his work, suggesting she'd admitted him to her small room at 13 Miller's Court voluntarily. The crime scene, described in such graphic detail by police reports that they remain difficult to read, showed what happens when the ordinary violence of Victorian prostitution escalated to its logical conclusion. But Mary's landlord, John McCarthy, told investigators something that revealed how thoroughly the system of exploitation was embedded in ordinary commerce. She owed 29 shillings in back rent. I was about to evict her. She knew this. So when a man offered enough money to cover the debt, why would she refuse him entry? This was the machinery that Victorian society had built. Women made so desperate by debt, hunger, and the absence of alternatives that they voluntarily opened their doors to whoever was waiting in the darkness, because the known danger of a strange man seemed preferable to the certain danger of homelessness in a London November. Mary had been 25 years old. She had been beautiful once, according to those who knew her. She had come from Ireland with dreams of respectable work and a decent life. Instead, she became a cautionary tale that respectable society used to reinforce its own moral boundaries, while refusing to examine the economic system that had delivered her to that room in Miller's Court. The Ripper murders forced brief public attention onto conditions in London's East End, but that attention proved remarkably shallow and short-lived. Newspapers documented the victim's degradation in lurid detail while maintaining careful moral distance. The Times described Mary Kelly as a woman of immoral character who consorted with the lowest class of society, language that positioned her death as regrettable, but somehow inevitable. The natural consequence of life choices rather than the product of systematic exploitation. Within months, public attention moved on. The murders stopped, or at least stopped being so theatrical that they demanded notice. And the women of Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Shadwell returned to their ordinary invisibility, negotiating prices in doorways, trying to earn enough for fourpence lodging, aging rapidly under conditions that ground them down year by year until they simply disappeared from the historical record without even the dubious immortality of becoming murder victims. Frances Coles, murdered in February 1891 under circumstances that might have connected to the Ripper, but received minimal attention because by then the public had exhausted its appetite for dead prostitutes. Alice Mackenzie, killed in July 1889, whose death bore similarities to the canonical murders but was quickly dismissed as imitation. Rose Mylett, found strangled in December 1888, whose murder was ruled accidental despite evidence suggesting otherwise because investigating violence against prostitutes required resources that authorities preferred to devote elsewhere. These women, and hundreds of others who died violently or simply died during the Victorian era, became footnotes or didn't even achieve that level of historical recognition. They were consumed by the machinery and forgotten by everyone, except perhaps a few friends from the lodging houses who noticed their absence and understood what it meant. The system that consumed them didn't end with the Victorian era. It simply evolved, adapted to new technologies and social arrangements while maintaining the same fundamental mathematics, that desperation could be converted into currency, that women's bodies could be bought and sold, that respectable society could maintain its moral authority by criminalizing the women while ignoring the men who purchased their services and the economic conditions that made such sales necessary for survival. Walk through any major city today, and you'll find the descendants of Victorian brothels operating behind different facades, the escort services advertised online, the massage parlors with neon signs, the women trafficked internationally with promises of legitimate work who discover too late that their debts have made them property. The fundamental relationships remain unchanged. Desperation on one side, desire on the other, with profit and power bridging the gap between them. The Victorian era's elaborate performance of moral outrage while simultaneously sustaining systematic exploitation finds its modern expression in legislative approaches that criminalize prostitution while doing nothing to address poverty, inequality, and lack of alternatives that make selling sex a rational choice for women with limited options. We still speak of fallen women and sex trafficking victims as though they exist in categories separate from the ordinary functioning of economic systems that require some people's exploitation for others' comfort. Picture Mary Kelly one final time, not as a victim in a crime scene photograph, but as a young woman stepping off the boat from County Limerick with her dreams intact. Picture her making the 1,000 small calculations that led from that moment to the November night when she opened her door to the darkness waiting outside. Each calculation rationale, each choice the best of available alternatives, each step logical until the final moment when logic led to a room in Miller's Court and a man with a knife. This is what Victorian society built, a machinery so efficient at converting human beings into currency that it operated for decades, while respectable people maintained comfortable ignorance of its existence. And when we look at the women it consumed, we're not looking at the distant past. We're looking at the reflection of systems that still operate today, still grinding women down, still maintaining the fiction that exploitation is choice and that survival strategies are moral failures rather than rational responses to impossible circumstances. The fog that night in Miller's Court has never truly lifted. It just moved to places where we've learned not to look.